second day of Alauddin Health Medical International Conference. And today, we're going to start the first session of our international conference. And we honor to have these three speakers.
Recording in progress.
Thank you for joining us, Mr. Salman Khan, MD, PhD from West Virginia University, and also Mr. Chibuzo Iolabuchi from Sandra, Colorado, USA, and Mr. Dr. Stephen Himley, MS, MPH from World Health Organization. Ladies and gentlemen, for the first session of our international conference today, we would like to invite our chairman of this session, Mr. Rudy Safaruddin, MPharm, Magister Epidemiology. Mr. Rudy?
Ya, suara saya bisa kedengaran?
Yes.
Oke.
Ladies and
Terima
gentlemen,
kasih.
enjoy your first session of international conference today.
Oke, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi, teman-teman Indonesia. So from now on, I'll be talking in English, and feel free to interrupt me whenever if I'm needed to speak in Bahasa. I'll be more than happy to do so. And welcome again to this wonderful international conference that we have. It's called ALHAMDIC, which stands for the Alauddin Health and Medical International Conference, with the theme today is advanced technology in health and medicine improving quality of life, being held hybridly in Makassar, South Sulawesi, in person, and also online or virtually here on Zoom. Please allow me to introduce myself. My name is Rudy. I'm currently here in West Virginia, United States of America. I'm finishing up my PhD degree in the Health and Services and Outcomes Research, West Virginia University in Morgantown. That's the name of the town. And right now, I will be acting as the moderator for this session, which has three amazing speakers. But before that, please allow me to say hi and thank you so much for the trust being given to me as the moderator and also as well as the translator. Feel free to everyone, the audience, if you have any questions, but you are kind of shy or to some extent feeling a little bit, not confident to speak in English, feel free to just say it in Bahasa. I'll help translate the questions or maybe statement that you guys want to make. Yeah, thank you so much for the Dean and the Vice Dean of the Medical and Health Science Faculty, Universitas Islam Negeri Alauddin di Goa, Sulawesi Selatan. Dan okay, I apologize. I've been trying to change my background. It's just something is not working well with my laptop, so I apologize that I haven't been able to change my background. But yes, I'm still here. I think the background, I'll try to work on it later if I can. So today we will have three speakers. Excuse me. So the first one is from West Virginia University, WVU Medicine Ruby Memorial Hospital. His name is Salman Khan, MD, so Dr. Salman Khan. And for the future reference, I will call him Dr. Khan. And then also the second one, we have Dr. Obi Iloabuchi. He's from Bristol Myers Squibb. It's a pharmaceutical company here in the US. And the third one, we will have Mr. Stephen Himley. He's representing WHO, World Health Organization. I believe he's also from, he's based in WHO, United States. Correct me if I'm wrong. But for the sake of time, I will try to introduce one speaker at a time, and I will let the speaker to present their slides. And we will be having at least 20 to 30 minutes to present the PowerPoint, the materials. And for the first speaker, so we have Dr. Khan, or Dr. Salman Khan, who is going to present the screening for pancreatic cancer issues and pitfalls. A very brief, excuse me, a very brief educational background of Dr. Khan. So Dr. Khan did his undergrad and medical degree at Northeast Ohio Medical University. He also completed the residency program in internal medicine here at WVU Medicine Ruby Memorial Hospital. And right now he's working as a hospitalist, again, at Ruby Memorial Hospital in Morgantown, West Virginia. Yeah, he's a very good friend of mine. And before I let Dr. Khan to present the PowerPoint, I will again reiterate that please feel free to interrupt me, or also I believe Dr. Khan doesn't mind if he's going to be interrupted in case if he speaks too fast, if he pretty much probably, you know, like say some terms that are not really understandable by some audience. And don't hesitate to use Bahasa. I'm here to help you translate and convey the messages. That being said, I will turn over the microphone to Dr. Khan.
Hey, Rudy,
Yes.
thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for tuning into this presentation. I'm going to share my screen, if that's okay, because I got the PowerPoint already pulled up. There we go. Okay, give me 1 second, everyone. Let me just... Okay, so by the way, I put up the presentation. If you guys can't see it or if you can't hear me, let me know. But otherwise, my name is Salman. I am a physician based, as Rudy mentioned, I'm a physician based in West Virginia. It's nice to meet everyone. I'm a good friend of Rudy's. I've known him for what, 3 or 4 years now, and we've done a lot of collaborative research together. So I work in West Virginia, and I'm an internal medicine physician. So pancreatic cancer, it's something that, so I'll be talking a little bit about pancreatic cancer, screening for pancreatic cancer. This topic, to be honest, you could spend a long time on this topic. I'm doing like a 30,000 foot overview of it, but I hope that after you guys listen to this presentation, you'll be able to understand kind of why pancreatic cancer, it's such a, I'm sure, I don't know, you know, I'm sure you might have heard a few things about pancreatic cancer. I hope you guys can understand a little bit more about it, and you know, why it's such a tough disease to find, and ways that we're working to kind of you know, solve some of the issues that come with pancreatic cancer screening. So I have no conflict of interest at all in in any of this stuff. So just a little bit about pancreatic cancer. So, you know, in the United States, pancreatic cancer is actually, in 10 years, in 2030, it's projected to be a third leading cause of cancer-related deaths in the United States. So, and pancreatic cancer, it's known to be a very devastating cancer. By the time it's diagnosed, it's usually too late to do anything about it, which is very unfortunate. And this is due to a lot of reasons. You know, unfortunately, by the time that you start having the symptoms of pancreatic cancer, like for example, if you have jaundice, if your skin is turning yellow, or if you've been losing weight, or some things that make you go to a doctor, by then it's usually too late. Most of the times when pancreatic cancer is discovered, it's stage 3 or 4, which means it's spread throughout the body. And at that point, there's really not much you can do there's not really much you can do about it at that point. So, usually it's discovered pretty late. And that's also a function of the fact that it's such a rare disease. It's in the general population in the United States, like 1.01% of people, like 1 in 10,000 people will end up being diagnosed with pancreatic cancer just in the general population. So it's an extremely rare disease, and trying to find it is like trying to find a needle in a haystack, even though it's such a deadly disease. So, unlike other cancers, for example, colon cancer or breast cancer, where in the United States you have established screening programs, pancreatic cancer, there is no established screening program to identify it, for the reasons I mentioned above. And another issue in this is that the tools that we do have currently to try and discover pancreatic cancer, because pancreatic cancer is so rare, if we use these tools, number one, they're expensive to use. And number two, there are high rates of false positive and false negative cases. For example, if you are screened for pancreatic cancer and we do a test and it says you might have it, well, then we have to do surgery, biopsies, a bunch of extra workup. And in the end, we might find out that you really didn't have pancreatic cancer, in which case we did a bunch of extra testing for essentially no reason. So, and this problem is compounded with diseases that are even rarer, such as pancreatic cancer. So, and the slide I'm presenting here, so there's different ways that you can, there's different ways, when I talk about screening tools, there's different ways that you can look for pancreatic cancer and identify it. If you suspect that someone has pancreatic cancer, one of the tools you can do, one of the procedures you can do is what's called an endoscopic ultrasound. And that's shown here. So the pancreas, it's a very hidden organ. It hides in the back of the body, right behind the stomach and the intestines. It's in the it's really far back in the abdomen. So in order to access it, if you think someone has cancer, you have to obviously biopsy the tissue. And part of that process for an endoscopic ultrasound is taking a probe. By the way, this is a procedure where you're put to sleep, you're put under anesthesia. But you take a probe, you go snake down the esophagus, you go to the stomach, and then you have to all the way go to the first part of the small intestine, the duodenum right here, in order to access this yellow. This is the pancreas right here. Oops. And as you can tell, it's at that point you're able to visualize the pancreas. You can do ultrasound, and then you can take a needle and actually biopsy some of the tissue. So this test is it's the gold standard for diagnosing pancreatic cancer, but having to do this test on the general population when the cancer is so rare, it would be technically unfeasible. The cost of this procedure and the number of false positive cases that will be identified, it's just it's too invasive or to be practical. So with that said, yes, pancreatic cancer, it's hard to find, but and currently the guidelines, the USPSTF, which is the United States Preventive Task Force, they recommend actually not to screen for pancreatic cancer in the general population. However, while the cancer may be rare in the general population, there are high risk groups of people who, they have a higher risk of developing pancreatic cancer. And in these groups, you could justify and form the basis for a screening strategy. In these groups, it's not necessarily finding a needle in the haystack. It's the cancer is much more prevalent. And I'm going to talk a little bit about these three groups today. And the first group right here are those with familial or inherited risk. So these are people who have who have a family history of pancreatic cancer, their mother, their father, cousins. The second group is those who have cystic lesions. So those who you find out, for example, that they have some sort of cyst on their pancreas. And then the last group, which is the focus of my research, is those who have new onset diabetics. So So, and again, this is a very brief overview of this whole topic, but talking about familiar inherited risks. So familiar inherited risks, those who have, so for the familiar part, someone who has a relative with pancreatic cancer, your risk of developing cancer, if you have someone who you're related to have cancer, is much higher than the general population. And the more relatives you have, the higher that risk. It can go even up to a 50% lifetime risk. For these people, the story is different. You definitely want to screen this group of people for cancer. The other group are those who have certain genetic mutations. So these I listed a couple: BRCA1 and CDKN2A1. So these mutations, if you carry this mutation, if you're part of a family that carries this mutation, your risk of developing cancer is higher. With that said, it's not really that much higher, and it's not that much higher, and it's really difficult to estimate. A lot of people have these mutations. Doesn't mean that they'll necessarily develop pancreatic cancer. It's hard to really estimate the risk of developing cancer if you just carry these mutations. However, these genetic disorders, so if you have any of these these are not exactly common syndromes, but these genetic disorders, Lynch syndrome, hereditary breast ovarian cancer syndrome, these disorders portend a much higher risk of concurrent pancreatic cancer. So what I mean by this is, and I think this next slide explains this a lot. A lot of people, not a lot of people, but a good number of people have these sort of isolated mutations that they carry in their family. Now, these mutations in and of themselves don't necessarily, it's hard to estimate how high your risk of pancreatic cancer is. But if you have another condition that is associated with that mutation, for example, if you are BRCA1 or any of the BRCA mutations, and then you also have concurrent breast and ovarian cancer, your risk is actually much higher than if you just had the mutation alone. So these mutations in and of themselves, hard to say, but if they come in association with a certain genetic disorder, yeah, you definitely have a higher risk of developing pancreatic cancer. Even if you have these syndromes and you don't know what mutations you have, your risk is still much higher of developing pancreatic cancer. So the second group we're going to talk about, those with cystic lesions. So these are people who, let's say you do a scan on someone, someone has a scan done of their abdomen for a different reason, and you find out they have a lesion on their pancreas, so it's discovered accidentally. These are pretty common in relatively common in the US. 8% of adults older than 70 have these isolated lesions. And, these cysts of the pancreas, just because you have it, it doesn't necessarily, it's actually pretty rare that that these cysts will become malignant and actually transform into pancreatic cancer. And, part of that is actually looking at the lesion itself. There's certain when you look at these lesions, some of them have characteristics that make them more high risk. Some of them have features that don't. So oftentimes it depends on those, I guess, high risk features. But even still, just because you're found to have a cyst doesn't mean you're going to develop pancreatic cancer. With that said, a lot of research, actually, there's growing research about sampling some of the fluid from these cysts for certain genetic mutations or certain biomarkers. And there's actually promising evidence that if you do this strategy, you can actually find some lesions that do have a higher risk of becoming malignant or becoming actually cancerous. So, and the last group I'm going to talk about is new onset diabetes. So, diabetes is a risk factor for pancreatic cancer. It's pretty shown that if you have type 2 diabetes, your risk of pancreatic cancer is 1 to 1.5 times that of the general population. So you have a higher risk, but it's not that much higher. However, if you have new onset diabetes, your risk of developing pancreatic cancer jumps up to approximately 1%. So what I mean by new onset diabetes, if right in the time period when someone first finds out that they have diabetes, in the 3 years after that time of diagnosis, your risk of developing pancreatic cancer is significantly higher. Excuse me. So, this group of new onset diabetes, there's been a lot of research in recent years into focusing how to identify those new onset diabetics who actually do have pancreatic cancer, as opposed to the typical type 2 diabetes you see in most people. So, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this towards the end. And this is kind of this slide is kind of illustrating that point about nuanced diabetes. So here you have people with pancreatic cancer, and you see that 1 in 4 people that are diagnosed with pancreatic cancer first had diabetes preceding the pancreatic cancer. And honestly, it's probably more. This is when they were diagnosed. You know, these 3 people might have actually had diabetes even before, they just weren't picked up. And as you can see here, this is the diabetes group. Of this group of 100 people, 1 of them with new onset diabetes is diagnosed with pancreatic cancer within 3 years. So I know 1 in 100 doesn't seem like a lot, but compared to the general population, your risk is much higher. It's much higher. So now this slide, this kind of summarizes everything I talked about in terms of screening strategies. So, you know, if we had to, pancreatic cancer, if we had to group it into two types, there's the inherited kind that I talked about. You know, if you have a family member who's had pancreatic cancer, or if you have a certain genetic disorder, and then there's others, non-inherited pancreatic cancer. So as you can see, only 10% of people who have pancreatic cancer have an inherited pancreatic cancer. So most people, they don't have any genetic syndrome. They don't have any family members that had it. It just kind of happened out of the blue. So, and in this 10%, as you can see, I know I kind of talked about it, but there's really no recommended. I mean, there's some guidelines, but there's no hard established guideline about how to screen this group. But it's in general doing some sort of annual imaging, like an endoscopic ultrasound, which I talked about earlier, an MRI is kind of the way to go. And a lot of it also depends on your risk. Like even in this group of people, your risk of developing pancreatic cancer really depends a lot on what kind of genetic syndrome you have, how many relatives you have that have pancreatic cancer, if the mutation is an autosomal dominant versus a recessive mutation. So there's a lot of heterogeneity with this within this group in terms of your risk of cancer. Now for non-inherited cancer, and why I say cancer, by the way, I mean pancreatic cancer. So non-inherited cancer, you have, as I mentioned, these people who have these cystic tumors. So, and there's 2 specific ones, intraductal papillary mucinous neoplasms or mucinous cystic neoplasms. I mean, this is not something necessarily you need to know, but these are the 2 types of pancreatic cysts that do have the potential to become cancer. And depending on depending on if you find high risk features or not, you need to have for this group of people, it's recommended to get some sort of screening either at 6 to 24 month intervals, depending on how, if there's worrisome features. Now, with new onset diabetes, as I mentioned, there's no established screening program, which is unfortunate because, as I mentioned earlier, 90%, of pancreatic cancer, 90% is this, most of it is this non-inherited kind. And of this 90%, probably the majority, almost all of them, or most of them have new onset diabetes. And right now, there's not an established screening program, but we're working on it. And then this is sort of represents people who you have like other clinical suspicion for having pancreatic cancer. So now how to screen individuals. I kind of talked about this, there's no established, to be honest, like right now, there's no established screening program for pancreatic cancer. They talk about, there are cancer registries where you do, annual screening. Like I mentioned, for those with a family risk or those who have certain genetic syndromes. And then also for these pancreatic cysts, if someone has a pancreatic cyst and they have certain high risk features, sometimes they'll immediately proceed with surgical resection of those cysts just to, catch the cancer before it spreads. Now, biomarkers. Biomarkers are actually, for any sort of cancer, biomarkers are important. For those who don't know, biomarkers are if you do like a blood test or some sort of urine test, or just to, for a certain tumor marker or some sort of marker that could represent or be a sign, quote unquote, of developing cancer. Now for pancreatic, for other types of cancers, like colon cancer, you have, I believe, CA125. you have CEA. There are certain biomarkers out there for different kinds of cancers. But for pancreatic cancer, there's really no established biomarker to screen for it. CA19-9, the one I mentioned here, it's not, so it is used in the management of pancreatic cancer, but not for diagnosing pancreatic cancer. It's not used to find out if someone has pancreatic cancer. What it is used for is to find out after you've treated someone for pancreatic cancer, after it's in remission, to find out if it's coming back. So this marker is actually good for kind of surveying people who've already had surgery or treatment for pancreatic cancer and seeing if it's going to recur. But it's not good. It's not good for the diagnosis. Any biomarker, and this is, I could spend a long time talking about just about this topic, but in general, any biomarker that's going to be useful for pancreatic cancer, it's going to need to have a high specificity, meaning that if it's negative, you can be confident that someone doesn't have pancreatic cancer. And the biomarkers, and this is not the case, it's definitely not the case with CA19-9, and it's something that we're still working on, I should say. Now, models based on electronic medical records. This is actually particularly relevant to new onset diabetes. Non-invasive models, prediction models do have a growing role in pancreatic cancer screening. Even especially with new onset diabetes. So as I mentioned, the prevalence among new onset diabetics, the prevalence of cancer is 1%. 1% is still not, they've done cost benefit studies to look at the overall cost per dollar, that would be cost per person or cost per year, that would justify screening someone. And at a 1% threshold, if only 1% of people are developing cancer, that's really not high enough prevalence to justify the use of those tests that I mentioned earlier, the endoscopic ultrasound, the MRI. I mean, to screen all these people to find a cancer that's a 1 in 100 chance, it's still too costly. It doesn't really justify, it's not really justified. But the use of non-invasive models, and I'm going to talk about these in a little bit, like the NPAC model and this model right here, they're easy to implement models that actually you can use and apply them to basically estimate someone's risk of developing cancer in the future. So for new onset diabetics, the application of these models could help select those new onset diabetics who do have a higher risk of cancer, a sort of quote unquote high risk cohort. And these are people that you definitely should screen for cancer. So, and this figure.
Just to confirm, you'd like to call Nicole Bryant mobile.
Sorry, my iPhone went off. That's funny. So in this figure right here, figure 4, this is the NPAC model that I talked about. So that's this model right here. So the NPAC model, this model is a model you apply to people who have new onset diabetes. And the goal of this model is to find out which of these people with diabetes, which of them are type 2 diabetics, so they don't have cancer, and which of them do have cancer. And the way this model works is, so basically it exploits the differences that we know differ between type 2 diabetes and diabetes secondary to pancreatic cancer. So I'm going to put this right, move this down so you can see. There we go. So, and so right here, what I mean by that is weight loss versus weight gain, pancreatic cancer is an older age, and then the rapid onset of diabetes. So for type 2 diabetes, so normal, typical diabetes, you're typically gaining weight. I mean, diabetes is a disorder of people who are overweight, obese. That's why they recommend weight loss for the management of diabetes. So typically these people are gaining weight before the diagnosis of diabetes. However, with pancreatic cancer, the diabetes you see with pancreatic cancer, you're actually losing weight before the onset of diabetes. So, and this model kind of exploits this difference right here. As you can tell, so, and I'm not going to you can, if you really were interested, you can probably look this up on it's a pretty popular model now, but just to kind of illustrate kind of how this model works. as you can see, this model has 3 scores: an age score, a weight score, and a change in your glucose score. And each score represents kind of those characteristics that differ between pancreatic cancer and type 2 diabetes. So for the change in weight, if you have a higher score right here, if you have a higher score, your risk of pancreatic cancer goes up. So it's -6 to +6. As you can see here with the +6 group, their change in weight, they have a -6 kg. And that means that they've lost, if you've lost more than 6 kgs between before the onset of your diabetes, you score 6 points. Your score, your risk of getting cancer is pretty high. On the flip side, if you've been gaining weight, so you see this person gaining 6 kgs, you score a -6, so you actually lose 6 points. So this kind of illustrates this how this kind of pattern and how it differs. And these categories also kind of exploit the patterns that differentiate pancreatic cancer from type 2 diabetes. So yeah. So in conclusion, pancreatic cancer, it's a deadly cancer due to its rarity. I hope if you got nothing from this talk, you definitely got that point. It's very deadly, and the reasons why deadly, it's mostly because it's just so rare. With that said, the goal for the way we can go forward with developing a pancreatic cancer screening program is to identify high-risk subgroups. And we talked about 3 of those subgroups: those who have family history / genetic disorders, those who have new onset diabetes, and those with cystic lesions. So, and the new onset diabetes group, of all those groups, I believe, in my opinion, I think the new onset diabetes group has the potential to be a bedrock for the formation of a pancreatic cancer screening program. So that's all I got. Those are my references. If you guys have any questions, feel free to ask me. So.
Yeah, the Q&A session will be open later on after the 3rd presentation. So if you don't mind to hold on here a little bit, or I'll let you know. You can turn off your camera, Dr. Khan, and probably the Q&A will be in 50 to 60 minutes from now.
Okay, I will be there for that. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Sure.
I appreciate it.
Sure. See ya. All right, thank you so much for Dr. Khan for such a very wonderful presentation. It's about PDAC. In case everyone is wondering what PDAC stands for, it's been well explained. It stands for pancreatic ductal adenocarcinoma, or we can call it pancreatic cancer. As a conclusion, it has been mentioned. Just watch out, especially I know that the audience in this conference, it's very diverse. We have pharmacy, medicine, and nursing, and then public health and midwifery, and other like health professionals as well. And yeah, I really hope that from the pancreatic cancer screening presentation that you just heard, I really hope you can gain some knowledge, and please feel free to ask questions later on, not now, because we're going to go forward with the 2nd presentation by Dr. Obi Iluabuchi. Give me 1 second. So he's going to be presenting the topic of artificial intelligence in health services research, interpretable machine learning methods. So it's about the application of machine learning in health studies. I already informed Dr. Iluabuchi that the audience is not specifically like one medicine or pharmacy or nursing, so it's very diverse. And don't be sure this material or this machine learning method can be applied to any health field. Without waiting any longer, I will shortly introduce you all to Dr. Iluabuchi. So Dr. Iluabuchi is one of my best friends in my department here in Health Services and Outcomes Research, West Virginia University. He graduated 2 years ago. Dr. Iloabuchi finished his undergraduate degree, his pharmacy degree in Nigeria at the University of Nigeria. And he continued with a PhD degree, Doctor of Philosophy in the field of health services and outcomes research at WVU, or West Virginia University in Morgantown. Right now, he's working as a senior manager pharmacoepidemiologist at Bristol Myers Squibb. It's a well-known pharmaceutical company here in the US and also internationally or globally. He's been around pretty, I don't know, I would say exploratory. He has worked in many institutions. He's been here as a graduate teaching assistant and also research assistant, and he also had worked at Global Value and Outcomes Manager at Boston Scientific, and right now he's working at Bristol Myers Squibb. And with that, I will turn over the microphone to Dr. Iloabuchi. The time is yours.
Thank you so much, Rudy, for the introduction. My mic okay?
Yeah, we can hear you clearly.
Awesome. Yeah, Rudy is a good friend. I would say I've known Rudy for the better part of 4+ years now. Yep. And it's been a pleasure working with you. I believe we actually published a paper together. That's how deep our collaboration goes. So we have a publication online where people can actually look and see that we have collaborated in various ways. So I appreciate the opportunity to actually come in and just, have a very quick presentation discussing the applications of machine learning in health services research. I'm a pharmacist by profession. I worked in hospital pharmacy for all of maybe 2 years before I decided I wanted to do more research, and that took me to industry. I worked for Novartis for about 2.5 years before I decided I wanted to go back to get a PhD. And post the PhD, I have worked for several companies at Amgen, at Boston Scientific, which is a medical device manufacturer. And then I'm currently at Bristol Myers Squibb, where I work with the immuno-oncology team, where we're developing cancer drugs that help activate the immune system to fight cancer. But today I'm not going to be talking about immuno-oncology. We're going to be focusing on how artificial intelligence can actually help us with doing certain health services research. And so without further ado, I'm going to share my screen now. So we can all proceed. All right. So to start, I'm just going to go through a quick outline. We're going to discuss what artificial intelligence is. We're going to look at AI specifically in healthcare, take a brief overview of traditional statistical approaches that we've used in the past or the time before now. And then finally, we're going to look at an example of machine learning in health services research. So a lot of people have asked this question: what is artificial intelligence? It's, to put it simply, is just application of computer systems or machines that mimic the human intelligence to allow them to perform tasks that human beings would normally perform. Tasks such as decision making in a hospital setting, object detection, for instance, with the new cars that can detect an object that the car is about to run into and automatically brake so that the driver doesn't run into an accident. And then as well as solving complex questions. And so there's been so many applications of machine learning in our current day-to-day, where we find it in aircraft, in weapons design systems, we find it now in medicine, and it's beginning to take over medicine. It's been estimated that by 2030, about artificial intelligence will contribute about $15 trillion to the global economy. In healthcare, we're finding it being used in things like early detection. For instance, the Apple Watch that currently uses AI algorithms to monitor an individual's vital signs and can be able to detect if an individual is about to have a heart attack. We also find AI being used in medical diagnosis, specifically in imaging. And it's expected that specifically within the space of imaging, AI should grow to about 2.5 billion US dollars by 2024. An interesting part of AI also in healthcare is the use of AI-based applications to collect, store, and reformat, and also retrieve medical data. Before now, most physicians, where they go into to see a patient, would have to go in with a PA, a physician's assistant, who takes notes for them as they are consulting with the patient, because it's important to record and put down everything, the entire interaction with the patient. With these new AI-based applications, it's possible for the physician to actually speak directly, and the AI powered application actually captures the entire interaction with the patient and automatically saves that interaction into the EHR. EHR means electronic health record. That means, so that way, every subsequent visit, there's going to be a record of this visit with the physician. There's so many other applications of AI in healthcare that we cannot be able to go over. We find it used in end-of-life care. We've found it used in early detection of disease. We've also found it being used to improve decision-making across so many different disease conditions. So why is healthcare and health service research critical? And what are the limitations that make it kind of difficult to do health service research? One of the major ones is the fact that individuals, so just people are very different. We can see that every day by just the variation in age, gender, race, health insurance status. And all of those different variables affect the way individuals respond to treatment. For example, most clinical trials at the end of the day give us an overall effect, an overall treatment effect that says, well, patients responded by having a blood pressure drop of 5 mmHg, so 5 millimeter mercury. However, they did not tell you that within that overall average or mean treatment effect, there are patients who had a higher treatment effect. So there are patients who got up to 10 millimeter mercury drop, and there were also patients who did not get up to 2 millimeter mercury drop. And these variations or heterogeneity of treatment effect are because of the fact that individuals vary, and the variations of these individual characteristics always affect or influence their responses to medication or therapeutic, whatever therapy they're receiving. Therefore, it becomes important for us to understand and carefully assess the factors that drive individual responses at an individual level to help us to be able to program one and to be also personalized care to the individual by understanding already how each individual is going to be likely to respond to a therapy before even putting that individual on the therapy. And so the question now arises, which analysis do we use? What method do we use to understand or to be able to understand how to categorize or what factors would influence this patient's responses? We could start with bivariate analysis. Bivariate analysis simply means using two variables. Multivariate analysis means using multiple variables. For instance, if we decided that the only thing that's important to know or to understand how a patient is going to respond is the patient's BMI, then we're just going to use two variables, the medication and the patient's BMI. And we can find the association between a patient's BMI and their response to medication. That's a bivariate analysis. We can also conduct certain tests that can give us differences within groups and between groups, and can also give us associations. Finally, we can use models to understand the associations between those individual variables and the patient's response. Now, we usually define models as miniature representations of reality, because what the models really do is they help us try to mimic a real world setting. So they basically try to understand or set up a pseudo real world where, for the patient's age, the patient's gender, the patient's race, the patient's insurance status, the patient's adherence is all known. And then we use all of these known variables to try to model how each individual is going to respond when they receive a particular medication. Now, with the advancement of electronic health records around the world, and especially in the US, we're able to use data from millions and also billions of doctor-patient interactions, and so many records of healthcare that have been received, including pharmacotherapy and every other type of therapy that patients have received. We can actually retrospectively use that data to try to understand how these variables influence or affect a patient's response to therapy. And if we're able to learn from those historical experiences or interactions, we will be able to apply the learnings that we have from those historical patient interactions to new patients, and to be able to actually understand how a new patient will be able to respond. And that is what modeling is. And so the process of using this data from just raw data of patient and physician interactions to getting to the evidence involves so many different steps. First, the interaction is captured, the data is entered into an EHR and cleaned, and then we can go ahead and create variables that represent the different factors that we think are important to measure the patient's response to therapy. After that, we can then use this data that has been cleaned and variables created to produce statistics. We can produce either descriptive statistics, like measures of central tendency and measures of dispersion. And we can also produce inferential statistics, meaning we can infer associations between one variable or one feature and a patient's response or the outcome. You can use tests of associations to do that, and we can also use models, which I had explained earlier, to do that. And then finally, we report those results. So many tools have been used historically to do these types of analysis that I've just listed above. One of the most popular ones was SPSS, and SAS also has become widely used. R is currently rapidly growing in use and may very soon actually overtake both SPSS and SAS. And so this study actually was done earlier, about 2015. And what they were looking at was trying to understand in published studies from academia, so published that were studied by people who work in universities, what was the most statistical software that they used for their publication, in their publication. And between 1995 all the way to 2010, we find that SPSS was the most popular software used. However, after 2010, SPSS use started to decline substantially. The same with SAS. SAS has been used specifically more for industry, but the use has also started to decline. However, when you notice the use of the R statistical package, which is an open source software, statistical software, has significantly been increasing since 2010, and it is slowly starting to overtake both the use of SAS and SPSS in both academia and in industry as well. When we looked at industry job postings to see what skills they required people to have to be able to work effectively in industry. We found that most of them required individuals to have SaaS proficiency. So industry is still hugely SaaS based. By industry, I mean pharma industry. There's still, most industries still use SaaS, but again, like I mentioned, they're starting progressively to move towards R more than SaaS. So we will discuss machine learning, and so I can at least introduce you to what machine learning is as a subsector of AI and how we can use them or we can apply them to health service research questions. So I like to use this example because it's a pretty common one. Machine learning models are methods that a computer uses to make and improve predictions based on data. So basically, if we already know data about something, example, the price of a house, how much a house costs, we can use that house pricing that we know to predict the price of a new house that we do not know the pricing. And all it needs to do is it feeds off of the different features or the different variables that it knows about the house and understands how each of those features predicts the price of a house, so that when we give it a new house that we do not know the price of, it is going to use what it knows already to predict the price of this new house. And this is what we call supervised learning. In this example, we want to know what the price of a new house is going to be. However, we know that if a house has trees around it, has 50 square meters on the first floor, and allows pets, it costs $310,000. Or does not allow pets, it costs $310,000. However, one that allows pets costs $320,000. So knowing that if we give a new set of house, maybe the house doesn't have any trees, it's 25 square meters, this model is going to predict how much the house is going to be based off of the data it already knows about the pricing and how these variables affect the cost of a house. So the question I've heard people ask me a lot is, why don't we just use the already existing white box models that we know? What's the need for using machine learning when the already existing models do a good job of already telling us the questions? And by white box models, I mean things like logistic regressions, which we have used historically for so many years to understand the associations between certain variables and the outcomes. And the reason those logistic regressions have become the mainstay and still used up to today is because they are clear. So the reason the model makes a prediction is very clear to every individual. It will tell you clearly that the age of the patient was one of the reasons it made the prediction, that the gender of the patient is another reason, that the sex of the patient is another reason. So everything it does is clear. However, with the black box models, which is what we call the machine learning models, it's more difficult for us to see what's going on under the hood, because it actually just takes all of this data, runs algorithms on the data, and predicts to us whether this patient is going to respond well or will not respond well. However, the model does not tell us exactly why it makes those predictions. That's why it's called black box, because you don't see the reason it's making those predictions. It's just making a prediction for you. So why do we still use them if they're black box? One of the reasons we continue to use them is because they are very, very accurate. Now, what you see here is a comparison of a logistic regression model and the metrics versus XGBoost model, which is a machine learning model. And what you see is that both in accuracy, sensitivity, specificity, and AUC, and this was the same exact research question, XGBoost performed significantly better every single time with accuracy, sensitivity, specificity, and AUC. meaning that the XGBoost model can always tell us with a 87% accuracy which patient is going to respond to a particular therapy and which patient will not respond to a particular therapy. However, what's the use of it telling us this if it cannot give us actionable insights? So why do we do health services research in the first place? One of the major reasons is because we want to be able to find variables or patient factors that are actionable. What modifiable characteristics can we use or can we find in this patient that will help us improve that patient outcomes? And if the model does not tell us which factors predicted the patient response, then we don't know what variables can be modified to improve those patient outcomes. So it's basically useless to us because yes, we predicted the patient will not respond, but we're not able to say, well, if we change this, or if we make this better, or if we improve this, maybe the patient will respond better to therapy. That is why it is important to be able to have interpretability with these black box models, so that even though when they predict with very high accuracy, they can also tell us why the predictions were made and exactly what we need to change or what variables we need to modify to improve patient outcomes. And so there are two types of machine explainable models or explainable machine learning models. One is called the global explanation models, and the other is called the individual explanation models. And we will look at them through some examples that I have later on in the slides. So I'm using an example of a study that I have done recently, and this study has been published in the Journal of Cancer Policy. So I will share the link later with you if you want to actually read in more detail how the machine learning models actually were used to make these predictions. So what we wanted to do with this study was we wanted to understand the association of incidence cancer to low-value non-cancer care among older Medicare beneficiaries. So Medicare pays for healthcare of people over 65 here in the United States. And so we use data from these individuals over 65 years who had cancer. And we wanted to understand the pattern of care they receive after they have a cancer diagnosis. And we decided to use machine learning models. A hypothesis for this study was that older fee-for-service Medicare beneficiaries with cancer were more likely to receive low-value care compared to the non-cancer control group. And this is a very quick example of what a global interpretation is. So after we had used the model and we had applied the model told us that one, the patient's age was one of the top variables that tells you whether a patient is going to have low value care or not. And another top feature was number of coexisting morbidities. So number of physical health conditions, whether the patient had hypertension, whether the patient had diabetes, whether the patient had pre-existing hypercholesterolemia. The number of it, the higher the number, the more the patient was likely to have low value care. And so what you're seeing here is one of the outputs of a machine learning model. And what this tells you is simply, these were the top features that predicted a patient having low value care or a patient's response to care. But this doesn't tell us a lot really about how a patient responds. This is just telling us that these were the top features that it used to predict whether a patient would have low value care or not. And so this particular plot here, which is called the importance plot, is a global explanation. The new plot here we're looking at is called a partial dependence plot. Now this plot goes deeper to explain each variable and how the variable affects the patient's care. For instance, let's look at the first one that we talked about earlier, the number of physical health conditions, so number of pre-existing comorbidities, we see that as the patient's comorbidities tends to increase, the probability of the patient having low value care also increases, meaning there is a positive association between the number of physical health conditions and a patient receiving low value care. However, in most cases, that association is not completely linear. And this becomes important because with most of our older models, they always assume a linear association, but life is never always linear. For instance, let's look at care fragmentation. With care fragmentation, we see that first, as care fragmentation increases, the probability of a patient having low value care first increases, but then between a value of 1 to 6, it plateaus, so it does not increase. However, over a value of care fragmentation of 6 and above, it starts to increase again, meaning that it is a complex association that may also be interacting with several other features or several other variables. And this is another reason why we need machine learning methods, because normally linear methods are not going to be able to show us these variations or these interactions and the nuanced associations between one variable and the outcome of interest. Another important global explanation is what we call the Shapley explanations in machine learning. Now, what these does, it simply uses color conventions to tell us how each variable impacts a patient's probability of receiving or having an outcome. So with these plots here, the color coding tells you whether a patient has or does not have that feature. For instance, with this one here that says number of physical health condition, the yellow color convention means the patient had lower chronic conditions. The purple color on the right-hand side shows us that the patient had higher chronic conditions. And so we notice that as the patient has more chronic conditions, the probability of having low value care continues to increase towards the right, meaning as the number of chronic conditions increases, the patient's probability of having low value care continues to increase too. So it is a positive association as well. A beautiful thing is called sharp dependence plots. And with sharp dependence plots, we're able to actually deep further in to understand the heterogeneity in treatment effects. So when you see here where there's variations, these here list the number of chronic conditions a patient has. So we have patients who had 0, we have patients who had 1, 2, all the way to 12 chronic conditions. However, what you notice on the 0 here is that for patients who had between 0 and 3 chronic conditions, they were not associated with low value care. However, after 3 or over 3 chronic conditions, a patient's probability of having low value care starts to increase. However, they are not all increasing with the same value. You do see how there's this large band that looks like a confidence interval. What it means is that the patient could have one patient could have a 0 contribution, whereas another patient could have a contribution of up to 20% or even up to 25%. Meaning it should be important to note that patients may respond differently even though they had the same number of chronic conditions. They may respond differently because there are also some other variables that differ between those patients and which may be leading to interactions, which brings me to the next thing I was going to talk about. When a machine learning model makes a prediction based on 2 features, we can decompose this prediction into 4 terms. There's going to be a constant term, a term for the first feature, another term for the second feature, and a term for the interaction. Now, the interaction between these 2 features may change the prediction that occurs by varying the features after considering the individual features. And that's why you see that variability in effect in individuals who have the same number of chronic conditions. And I will use the next slide as an example to show you this. This example shows the interaction between age and cancer and the probability of our outcome low value care. The purple color represents people who have cancer. Yellow represents people who do not have cancer, our control group. And you notice how they are all congregated around 0 at the beginning. However, this is age on the x-axis. As patients begin to age, the probability of having low value care still stays even or below 0. So there's not an association. But you notice how after the age of 79, they flip. The flip means that after 79 years of age, patients who have cancer become more likely to have poorer care or to receive low value care. Whereas patients who were younger than 79, who were more likely to have an outcome of low value care, suddenly become less likely to have low value care. So this is showing you the interaction between growing older and having cancer, how these two variables interact. And before, using our normal conventional statistical methods, it was not possible to see these nuanced interactions, but with machine learning methods, we're able to see how each small variable interacts with each other. So whereas, for instance, the same patient who was 80, you have two patients, one is 80 years of age, but does not have cancer. His risks suddenly drop lower. Whereas the other person is 80 years old, but has cancer, his risk just suddenly increases. So these nuanced interactions are one of the things that are responsible for these variations that we see in each individual, where it seems like these individuals have the same number of physical health conditions, but their response is very different. So that's one of the key importances of the reason why we use these explainable machine learning methods. So this is the paper I mentioned about where we use these methods, low value care and excess out-of-pocket expenditure. And so feel free to go read the paper. It's published in the Journal of Cancer Policy. And if you have any questions, feel free to send me a message and I'll be happy to respond. And that should be the last slide. And I'll be open to questions if you have any.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ilabuchi. So briefly, in summary, what we just learned from the presentation, that we used to have like a very traditional approach of doing our analysis. We do bivariate analysis, multivariate analysis with regressions. That could be logistics, or that could be logistic regression, linear regression, or any other types of quote unquote traditional methods. And like these days, there is this artificial intelligence, in this case, machine learning approach that has been developed. And again, I cannot emphasize even more that this method can be applied to any health fields. Am I correct, Dr. Ilabuchi? Okay, yeah, thank you so much. Please allow me to...
I'm sorry, the methods can be used for any healthcare question you have. Nice. So it's not limited to just the questions that you saw me answer. This is just an example. And you can use it to answer any question across the healthcare space.
Nice. Yep. Please allow me to speak in bahasa for a few seconds. Jadi teman-teman semua, ini metode yang baru, dan selama ini kan kita selalu belajarnya yang analisa biasa, dalam hal ini yang regresi tadi yang saya sebutkan. Sekarang ini sudah mulai mengarah ke sini, dan ini juga sebenarnya tidak hanya bidang seperti yang saya tekuni, clinical pharmacy, farmasi klinis, ataupun yang menggunakan manusia. Tapi kalau misalnya ada data lain, itu tetap bisa teman-teman fitokimia, kemudian pharmacogenesis, and microbiology, or any other fields. Or teman-teman in nursing, medicine. Saya punya background epidemiology, jadi public health for sure is also applicable. Yeah, I apologize to the third speaker that we probably have to push back a little bit, but feel free to use as much time as you need. Hopefully you can complete the presentation in about like 30 minutes. And before I turn over the microphone to Mr. Stephen Himley, please allow me to introduce our third distinguished speaker. So what I have here, the third speaker, Mr. Stephen Himley, he did his Master's of Science, master's degree. The first one, wow, impressive. The first one was at University of California, Davis, California. And then he did his second master's degree, Master of Public Health, at the University of Washington, Seattle, Washington State, here in the US. And Mr. Himley has been so experienced in the field. He started with by being biomedical engineer, and then he has worked in so many agencies, institutions. I cannot mention all of these, but wonderfully, he has worked at the US FDA, United States Food and Drug Administration, in Bahasa, Badan POM, Badan Pengawal untuk yang di Indonesia ya, obat dan makanan. And then right now he works as a technical officer at the World Health Organization's regional office for Southeast Asia, based in New Delhi, India. Without further ado, Mr. Himley, please take over the microphone. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, thank you to everyone to attend this workshop. I'm sharing my screen here. See that. Okay. Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. Thank you to the honorable members of the government of Indonesia and the leadership and faculty of the State University of Al-Adin, the organizers and staff of this conference, and the students and other attendees. I have no disclosures, and today I'm going to focus on the improved quality of life, but really about the access. So health technologies and how they affect access to improved quality of life. So outline of my talk here, just a brief snapshot of health technologies. The quality of life impact depends on the access to these technologies, and that there is a tension. You know, many of the students attending here will impact where technologies get applied, the technologies that get developed, policy on affecting technologies and their access. So I think it's really important to talk about this tension between profitability and health impact. I'll speak a little bit about some technologies that are built to improve access. And then I was asked to share a little bit about enabling environments and networks and sharing for health technologies. So there are some 2 million different kinds of medical devices. And by the way, you know, health technologies involve everything from medicines and biologics and vaccines and medical devices. From this talk, I'm going to focus mostly on medical devices, but there are about 2 million different kinds of devices and 7,000 plus generic device groups, and they do everything from prevention, helping to prevent disease, protect caregivers, screening for identification of diseases and health conditions. They do direct diagnostic tests. They are used in treatment, they're used to monitor, they're used for rehabilitation and palliation or end-of-life care. So advancing health technologies or developing them really is all about improving life. Here in India, where I'm based, there are 3,000 plus startups in the Indian health tech space. and they do work on a wide variety of areas. So doing online pharmacies, telemedicine, personal health management, like the Apple Watch that was shown, delivery, integration of care, the diagnostics, the electronic medical records, the clinicians, lower level care to tertiary care, diagnostics, devices, etc. But a key question is, whose quality of life improves? So I pulled this slide from one of the studies we had done here in the Southeast Asia region. And it's just one indicator. So if you look at under 5 mortality rate, which is the Sustainable Development Goal, under 3.2, and you look by income across these particular 8 Southeast Asia region member states, and you look at the poorest quintile versus the richest quintile, the under 5 mortality rate, say for Indonesia, ranges from something about just under 25 to more than 50, depending on if you're in the richest group, you have lower mortality, or you're in the poorest group and you have a much higher mortality. And you can repeat this for lots of other indicators of health outcomes. A major driver for this is poor access to health technologies. The poorest don't have access to individual diagnostics at the lower levels. They don't have pulse oximeters, radiography, ultrasound, insecticide-treated bed nets, etc. And if you just look at diagnostic devices, it's the weakest link in the care cascade. So, what's the care cascade? Person has symptoms, goes to a clinic, gets some diagnostics tests or some assessment, receives a diagnosis, gets prescribed treatments, conducts the treatments. So diagnostics is really the weakest link in that cascade. So the Lancet Commission on Diagnostic published last year a paper called Transforming Access to Diagnostics. And they showed that in low income and lower middle income countries, less than 1 out of 5 people in the entire country has access to the simplest of diagnostic tests at primary healthcare level. And this is outside of the vertical programs such as for HIV and malaria. This is very damning of our societies that this exists. Now, if you look at where is the focus for investment on health technologies, this is a graph from investment in India. So extramural funding. So if a group, a startup needs funding for development of their technology, they get funds from outside somewhere. And in 2015, 23% of these technologies had a focus on people who have low resource. And more than 3/4 are focused on high resource groups, so wealthy people. Why is this? Wealthy people have access, and so they have a high willingness to pay. They want faster access to diagnostics. They want better results compared to the current results from technologies that they currently have access to. And if you were to repeat this graph for a wealthy country such as the United States, from where I'm from, it's probably this 77% goes way above 90%. So very few funding goes to people who don't have access to technologies or to healthcare in general. So there is this attention in advancing health technologies. Risks and limited venture funding mean that there's a push for higher confidence in profitable success. So that means focus on technologies that are for wealthy people, versus the greatest quality of life gains are in the technologies that focus on least wealthy people. There's a lot of data that shows that increasing access to healthcare for the poorest people has the greatest gains in health improvement, health outcomes. So one of the points I want to make in this talk to the entire audience is that this is not talked about, but it's real. And so, it's not an easy solution. You can't just say, well, just forget about risk and limited venture funding and just focus on the people without access. It's not that simple because there are limited funds, and but too often in the startups that I worked in the multinational companies that I worked in, this never gets discussed. It's just, well, we have to make sure we have the best outcomes financially. So what I would ask this audience is to hold this tension when choosing what to develop, what to work on. If you're thinking of a startup company, you think, well, I could probably make a lot of money if I focus on the American people who are already have health insurance and they just need better outcomes, versus there are billions of people who don't have access to blood pressure measurement or a glucometer or really simple technologies due to cost. And you could work on technologies that lower those costs. You say, yeah, but my margin for success is lower and I won't make as much money. Well, those are choices that we have. So let's hold that tension. And secondly, public policy can influence this. So public funders can decide whether to fund what might be look more successful as far as more successful startups, or they can fund stuff that prioritizes equitable access and population health impact. Okay, enough about the tension, but please remember it. If you look at the human resources gap, it's global. This is an image of the Southeast Asia region, and there is a figure of 44.5 doctors and nurses per 10,000 population that is required in order to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. And if you look here, what areas of the region have actually enough doctors and nurses to accomplish this? There are very few. Most of the region does not have that. So this equals low access to care. But health technologies can help address that gap. Point of care diagnostics, something simple as a urine dipstick can be made available at the first primary healthcare clinic level where there is no laboratory. And that can help address the gap because you don't need to be a nurse or a doctor to apply that test. And then there's digital health technologies that enable anyone who has a phone to access care without needing to go to a high-level care facility. Point of care diagnostics, they improve access at the primary healthcare level, such as this is a pulse oximeter. There can be pediatric pulse or neonatal pulse oximeters that improve care for newborns. At the community level, I think this is a glucose testing at the community. And then even at home, this is an HIV test, self-test. And then there's a whole field of digital health technologies, which we just sort of talk on artificial intelligence. There's many other digital technologies that are tools that can improve health and access to healthcare. I won't go over each of these, but digital health technologies have lots of impact. They enhance health outcomes via data-based treatment decisions, software as a medical device, digital therapeutics, improving diagnosis, facilitating clinical trials, improving person-centered care, enabling self-managed care, increasing evidence-based knowledge, and improving skills and competence of the healthcare professionals. There's a lot of work going on in digital health technologies. So shifting now over to how access to health technologies requires enabling systems and networks. High quality products need to be acceptable, available, accessible, affordable, et cetera. And it involves the research and development, product design, but all this happens through enabling environments. either private and public sectors. So publicly funded, privately funded, and supported. There need to be regulatory systems to get these technologies out to the market. Health technology assessments to determine if these technologies should be covered in benefits packages, national policy to support all this. And again, I emphasize that there should be prioritization on equitable access and population health impact. And one way that is newly available that can be done by national countries is to determine a list of essential diagnostics. So I'm just going to talk about these ones in blue for the rest of the talk. Regulatory networks. There are national regulatory agencies that get together within our region through the Southeast Asian Regulatory Network. And they do information sharing, system strengthening, convergence, which is determining common regulatory requirements, collaboration amongst each other. And there's many other regulatory networks and alliances, the African Medicines Regulatory Harmonization, Western Pacific Regional Alliance, Global Harmonization Working Party. For government support, I pulled some examples from India because it's kind of interesting. So in the United States, you know, there's a small business innovative research grant system that has existed for many decades and has encouraged lots of health technologies to be developed. But in India, there's a national digital health mission, which intends to digitize healthcare in India. So it's a government supported effort for electronic medical records and access of health records for patients and in clinical facilities. There's a National Innovation Foundation that strengthens grassroots tech innovations. And there's Startup India, which is for all technologies, not just health technologies. But it fosters entrepreneurship through tinkering labs, research parks, seed funding, incubators, tax incentives, assistance with compliance and regulatory hurdles, forming international bridges with high-income countries. And example of what a country can do after 5 years, there are 41,000 plus startups recognized, 500,000 site users. They've formed 163 accelerators and more than 640 incubators. So within 5 years, you know, when a government says we're going to help foster development of health technologies, it can be done. Moving to the global level, this is the COVID-19 Technology Access Pool, or CTAP. The objective is to facilitate timely, equitable, and affordable access of COVID-19 health products by boosting their supply. And so they've taken, like, for example, the NIH in the US provided access to vaccines, COVID-19 vaccines, to this pool. And but there's others, there's therapeutics, diagnostics, devices, software. And the platform involves taking intellectual property and other knowledge and data and helping it to be accessible to the non-rich world. I won't go over this slide in detail, but essentially what the WHO CTAP does is match technology holders with technology receivers. So the technology holders provide licensing and technology agreements through WHO CTAP, which sublicenses them to the technology receivers, which are manufacturers and distributors. So there's incentives that are given to the technology holders and technical support given to the technology receivers. And so what's been happening as of July of this year, there's, for example, 1 imaging tech, there's 4 respiratory care technologies, 1 disinfection technology, personal protective equipment, coding technology that are in the pipeline for development. There is a WHO compendium of innovative health technologies for low resource settings, and this was used as a prioritization of what technologies should be brought into the tech pipeline. But the CTAP staff told me that COVID-19 is eventually going to subside. It's not gone yet, but as it does, this program should still be available for continuing for non-COVID type of technologies. And then there's a new effort within WHO called the Essential Diagnostics List. It's an evidence-based register of categories of in vitro diagnostic tests and the recommendations for use of those tests. So this is available online. It has for each test an assay format, test purpose, specimen type, and it's categorized into facilities with clinical labs, such as hospitals, and facilities without clinical labs, such as primary healthcare clinics. And just for history, the first essential medicines list was published in 1977. And there's more than 150 countries that have essential medicines lists. But the first essential diagnostics list was not published until just a few years ago, 2018. There's a guidance for how to create a national essential diagnostics list. So there are two countries that have completed this, India and Nigeria. I'm working with Nepal and Timor-Leste currently to develop national essential diagnostics lists. Maldives has committed to doing this next year. And I've held conversations with ministries of health in Bhutan and Indonesia, which are considering to do this. We held a knowledge sharing workshop earlier this year about essential diagnostics. But one of the reasons I'm bringing this up here in this conference is that national essential diagnostics lists, their existence help catalyze development of new point of care diagnostics tests. So what they do is they provide market focus. When there is a limited set of diagnostics that a country says, okay, we want all of these available at all of our primary healthcare centers and all of our secondary care hospitals and tertiary care hospitals, that's a market focus that then companies can say, okay, if I make a cheaper test or if I convert an existing diagnostic test into a point of care test, we know there's a market. I'm not going to go over this list entirely, but this is mostly for the health policy people, the government people, say, why develop a national essential diagnostic list? There are a ton of impacts that, direct quality, direct clinical care impacts. And then there's indirect things, which any one of these, you might say that's reason enough to do this. It decreases out-of-pocket spending through increasing the availability of quality, affordable diagnostics instead of going to somewhere else to try to get diagnostic tests. It decreases antimicrobial resistance, which is an enormous problem that we are facing, and it's going to, some would say, explode in the next 10 years. But again, I'll point out that by having a limited set of IVDs, it provides market focus, which catalyzes new point of care devices. And when you have new point of care devices, rapid point of care, that eliminates delayed turnaround and patient leakage, which is when a patient goes in, gets a test, and they say thank you, and they maybe send the blood sample off to a higher care facility, and then the test comes back, 24 hours later, and the patient's gone, and the patient doesn't want to come back. Or they had a poor interaction, so they're not coming back. Whereas point of care means immediate, nearly immediate information, so that improves access to care. In conclusions, health technologies are wonders for improving quality of life. Please mind the tension between profitability and health impact for those without access. And if you at all have input into public policy, encourage that enabling environments for health technology development be created, but prioritize technologies for equitable access and population health impact. And also finally, please advocate for developing and implementing a nationally central diagnostics list. Thank you.
Wow. Wow, 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 wow. Thank you so much, Mr. Himley. Or in this case, if I may, Stephen, thank you so much for doing what you're doing. I'm so impressed. And as everyone has already seen that the presentation was all about health technologies, specifically on the access for improved quality of life. And I'm trying to summarize everything what I've learned from the presentation. Basically, right now, so studies and also like facts being collected in the field, so we have found that there's a health disparity, or in this case, probably inequities between those awesome like rich people versus poor people. And one of the countries that like being mentioned in the slides is Indonesia, and we have to work on pretty much, on the steps to improve to pretty much minimize the health disparities or inequities. And one last thing that I gained from the presentation is that we need to all stakeholders, government, and then the health professionals, we have to work together in order to prioritize the equitable access and pretty much working on the population health in general. It doesn't matter whether you're rich or you're poor. Yeah, it's such a very dilemmatic situation to be in, whether we have to, like you said, tension, maybe if I may, dilemma between focusing on profitable success, or in this case, where is it, my note? Technology for the least healthy, the least wealthy people. Allow me again to speak bahasa for a few seconds. Teman-teman sekalian, setelah kita simak bersama, jadi sekarang ini health disparity ada. Jadi perbedaan dapatan pelayanan kesehatan begitu, miskin lawan kaya untuk dalam hal ini, dan masih banyak lagi variabel yang harus difokuskan. Tapi saat ini Indonesia adalah salah satu negara yang kita harus bekerja bersama untuk bagaimana mengecilkan perbedaan untuk kesenjangan sosial dan kesenjangan kesehatan begitu. Yep, that's all. We have wrapped up all the 3 presentations, and I will open the Q&A session for everyone. Feel free to address your questions, whether it's in English or in Bahasa. I'm here to translate if needed. Okay, I will check the chat box if there is any. Since we have a hybrid, okay, there's one. Since we have a hybrid conference today, so if I'm not really recognizing like anyone who is going to be asking in person, please let me know by any means. Okay, I will read this first one. For Dr. Salman Khan, the model for pancreatic cancer screening, is it recommended to all new onset of diabetes? And the second question would be, in the model, is the blood glucose, the fasting or the present or random blood glucose? Thank you for the enlightenment. Okay, I will let Dr. Khan to answer that.
Yeah. So in terms of the glucose, it has to be. It kind of depends. In the original study, they looked at patients who had an established diagnosis of diabetes based on specific glycemic criteria. I think the ADA recommend, like a first-time hemoglobin A1C greater than 6.5, and then you have to have a previous glucose within ideally from the preceding year. I believe they did a fast, in the original study, it was a fasting glucose. With that said, like Rudy and I, we did a validation study in which it wasn't necessarily a fasting glucose. We used a previous hemoglobin A1C instead. And the model still performed pretty well. So there wasn't, I mean, I think it's interchangeable. You know, whether you use, we've shown that you could either use a fasting glucose or a hemoglobin A1C. In terms of a random blood glucose, you have to be careful because random blood glucoses, I mean, they can be artificially elevated. You know, they can be, if you eat something sweet, you know, it's not as a controlled study. It's not as a controlled lab. So because the preceding glucose in the model, you want to look at the change. So the one from a year before should not be, I mean, if it's skewed elevated, it's going to completely mess up that part of the score. So ideally, you should have a previous A1C or fasting glucose. You could use a random glucose if you think it's reliable and it's like less than 140, but that hasn't been studied as much. So the other thing is this model, it's been retrospectively validated, but not prospectively validated. What I mean is that the model, there's currently studies ongoing where we're actually getting a cohort of people with nuanced diabetes, and we're going to apply the model for these people at the onset of their diabetes and see how and follow them along, see how they, see whether they develop pancreatic cancer. I'm not in that study specifically, but it's something that's ongoing with a consortium of people of different universities in the United States. So I hope that answered that question.
Thanks so much. The previous questions were from Andi Paradila, and then she also has a follow-up. This question is for Dr. Khan and Dr. Olabuchi. When processing the predicting models, like how much data will be enough to start with? And is there any period when we need to evaluate the model that we develop?
I can let my colleague answer that question. It might be better for him. So.
Okay, so 2 questions. I'll start with the first one. Data density is an important question with machine learning. In general, it's going to be dependent on the number of variables that you have. A rough estimate is that if you should use at least 20. So when we're using traditional methods, it's 20 participants a variable you want to include. So if you're trying to evaluate 10 different variables, anticipate that you need at least 200 patients. That's a rough estimate to start with. And of course, the more data you have, the more individuals your model has to learn from, and that helps your model improve, because basically your model is learning from 2 things. It's learning from the number of people it's seeing. So the more people it sees, the more it learns, and the better the prediction of the model is. So in general, you want to have more to improve the accuracy of your model. And to answer your second question, there are 2 methods that we have been using recently. One called the temporal method model, and the other called non-temporal method. Now, if you're interested in following patients to understand when in time they have an outcome, then you want to use a temporal approach where you're consistently measuring the data or the variables almost as it occurs temporarily, because we are trying to use the current data to predict the time when an event is going to happen. For instance, I've actually used this recently where we were trying to work on certain diseases to understand when patients are going to develop an adverse event when they're being treated for cancer. And so what we did was, based on what we already know, we can actually have their data consistently updated every day. And when we put this data into our model, we can tell you that in cycle 1 or in cycle 2 of chemotherapy, a patient is going to be more likely to develop this adverse event or another adverse event based on what we know and how much the data and how much the model has learned from preceding data about what factors are likely to influence. So that is the value of a temporal approach. In a non-temporal approach, we can get data that was captured 2 years ago and still use it to train our model. So if you're interested in knowing when, or if you're interested in using with or adding time, then you want to use a temporal approach. If you're not interested in the time variable on when something happens, you can use data captured 10 years ago to do your research, and it will still give you the answers you want to.
I see. Any additional explanation, Dr. Khan?
Yeah, what was the second part of that question again?
Like, when should we evaluate the model? Like, at what phase, I believe?
Yeah, at least from my experience, you know, for clinical models where you're going to use it in like either an outpatient or an inpatient setting, you need to do some sort of prospective evaluation. Like models tend to, yes, models do good on data, but you know, you can't necessarily, those results are not necessarily going to be replicated into the real world setting. So, and that's like, I can't remember, there's one study that I looked at where they actually, they did a machine model for like predicting outcomes with cardiac disease. And they applied this to a cohort of patients. This was back in Texas. And the model ended up completely missing the mark because of, you know, some of the variables were actually associated with the outcome itself. And this created some kind of bias. So, you know, I'm not like an expert. I don't do like model development or things like that. So, but I do know that at least like from a clinician side, it's important to actually apply these models to the real world setting to see how they do. I mean, it's like the highest quality of evidence for sure. So, you know, there's a lot of clinical models for like lots of diseases that, you know, that have been valid either in a lab setting or like, you know, like at the cellular level or like in animal models. But, you know, when you translate it to the population level, when you actually apply them to people, they don't work for like various reasons. So, so yeah, that's the most important thing. But that's, I mean, that's kind of obvious. I mean, everyone who does this kind of stuff knows that. So.
Yeah, thank you so much for the answers. I really hope that Andi Faradila is satisfied with the answers. And moving forward, I got one question for Mr. Himley. So has WHO worked on the aspect of health professionals in terms of minimizing the health inequities? For example, like in this case, I think, one second, in the US, it's very well known that pharmacists they work as frontliners. They can just like walk in and then like get tested. The patients can get tested for their cholesterol, blood sugar level, and so on. Like you said, the IVDs, in vitro diagnostics. But is there any studies or like efforts in terms of not only providing the funding and working with the government, but from the health professional aspect?
So from the health professional aspect, you mean to get health professionals out to rural areas, that sort of thing?
Something like that.
Yeah,
And pretty much to make the distance or the access to care being more accessible for the poor.
Yeah, definitely. There's something called the 6 pillars of a healthy health system, a robust health system. One of those is human resources for health. And so we have 2 individuals in our office that only work on that. And they assist governments in monitoring and measuring and finding out what works. There's a ton of research published on how to encourage healthcare workers to be placed in rural areas or in inaccessible areas, recruiting them from there, incentives to work there. So yeah, there's a lot of work on that. It's not my area of expertise. Thanks.
I see. Thank you so much. Yeah, the next question will be delivered directly from Siti Akma. Organizing committee, if you can help me with open her mic. Yes.
Hello. Okay, so excuse me. Maybe you guys, can you hear my voice?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you. I'm Siti Akma, one of the representative of the Department of Midwifery Stigia Makassar. So this is the interesting discussion for today. Thank you so much for all of the speakers. I have a question for Mr. Obi and also Mr. Himley. So this is nice to meet you because you are one of the representative from WHO program. So for the first question is about the healthcare that Mr. Obi said that in the healthcare, so AI will have the healthcare workers to finish their their job actually to observe the patients and also to finish to find some diagnose in the patient. So if we have like the situation that the health workers don't want to left behind from the technology, especially from AI. So what is your suggestions or advice for the health workers to can stand together with the AI to combine or to collaborate with the technology in the healthcare center? And also for the Mr. Himley. So maybe you know Indonesia is the archipelago country. So we have many islands here. Please give you the advices also for us as an educator and then also as a healthcare centers. So how can we manage all of the island in Indonesia to serve all of the society here to get the good and better health care from the health worker? So maybe WHO has the specific event or activity to manage or to help Indonesia to tackle the health problem in our country. Thank you so much.
Okay. Yep, the questions are for Dr. Ilabuchi and Mr. Himley. If I can summarize, I believe the first one was about like artificial intelligence application in health or clinical setting. We know that AI devices in this case are, let's say, they happen to be known, they're able to help in diagnostics and probably like some creative medications and whatsoever. It's just what if the health professionals do not want to rely on them, or like how we basically approach it. That's first, please, Dr. Ilabuchi.
That's a great question. I like that Salman is here because it's a question that has been as old as time. We have had conversations with so many different physicians about whether we're trying to really make clinical practice obviated with technology, right? And it's been said so many times, where are we trying to take away clinicians' decision making with all of this technology? But the truth is, no, we are not. These technologies are supposed to help, one, improve productivity, increase access. And I say increase access because let's think about this. In certain countries, including the country where I come from, it's one physician to over 30,000 patients. That's how little physicians there are in the country. I was originally from Nigeria. It's even less than that. I believe Himley might have the more accurate data currently, but it was like 1 to something in those thousands. And so with AI, what we intend to do is actually to help improve access to those people who typically would not have access because, one, the physicians do not have enough time to actually focus and to give patients all the time they need to actually consult with them. And so in that case, having a decision support tool that helps the clinician move through patients quickly and have some of those additional tasks that really do not need his decision making, or have something that already has said, this is already collected, so you don't have to waste X number of hours trying to enter this data, or this is probably the best therapy for this patient based on all the patient's history that we've already seen. It actually helps the physician move quickly through consultations and helps to improve, one, patient outcomes, reduce the risk of errors, because then there's someone on the backside or AI on the backside that's double checking the work or double checking all the entries to make sure that everything actually aligns the way it should be. In surgery, for instance, we have AIs that are currently helping physicians and assisting physicians in surgeries that we couldn't do before now. Robotic surgeries in every field and every sector. So AI is not here to take over the job of the clinicians. It is actually here to assist and to at least to advance technology in a way we can actually help meet the patient's needs better and make it more, improve outcomes for the patient themselves and make the work on the physicians a lot less tasking.
Okay. Any little comment from you, Dr. Khan,
Yeah.
Salman?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I'm just wondering if he has some insight on that.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not a hater of AI. I definitely not. I mean, I agree with what you said. AI is important, especially. I mean, we use AI a lot, even in the clinical setting. For example, with EKGs, having artificial intelligence read EKGs, it really helps out a lot. With radiomics, that's another big thing, particularly with pancreatic cancer screening, like having AI be able to interpret CT scans or other imaging tests to diagnose, pancreatic cancer. I mean, it's important. There's no question about it. And actually, in some things, it can do better than a clinician. So it's a collaboration. And I don't think, there's always people that say that AI, there are always people that are going to say that AI is going to take over our jobs, but no, I don't think so. The world's getting more complex, there's more information, there's more to learn. So it's a tool to help us, in my opinion.
Gotcha. Yeah, Siti Akmal, that's the answer. Can I go to the second question to Mr. Himley? May I?
Yes. Okay. So I got a point that what you try to describe to me and to all of the audiences today, because we don't think that we will compete with the AI, but yeah, as a health worker and educator also, we have to stand together with AA to reach the health better service from the healthcare center or hospital. Okay, thank you so much. Yes.
Yes. And then the second questions for the other audience, I'd like to reiterate, Indonesia being archipelago, that creates health issues revolving around access to care, starting from health professionals, availability, and also point of care testing devices. Does WHO has worked on a program like that, or any effort towards that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Maybe a little background on how WHO works. We're a decentralized organization. So even though there's a headquarters in Geneva, we're split up into 6 regions. And in the Southeast Asia region, we have 11 member states. The work we do is at the request of member states. So when a country says, we want you to help with this, then we respond to that request. And that's our priority. About every 5 years, we do country cooperation strategies with each member state. So you can look online for Indonesia's country cooperation strategy. There's 5 priorities, strategic priorities that the country of Indonesia, the government has requested us to prioritize and to work on. In addition to that, we get requests throughout the year from the government to say, please help us with this. Something has popped up, like in the country cooperation strategy, there's nothing about COVID-19, of course. And yet they requested help on point of care diagnostics for COVID-19. All that said, I'll bring up again what I talked about, the National Essential Diagnostics List. That's one way where in an archipelago or any places where there's difficult to reach situations, you know, supply chains for any commodity, excuse me, is difficult. So, you know, there's too much and too many to keep track of, cold chain and just quantities of supplies and consumables, equipment to maintain and to make sure is available at every health facility that's under the responsibility of the Ministry of Health, or if not at the central level, then, you know, at the district level, provincial level. There are tools such as an essential diagnostic list that says these are the essential ones. The same thing happened with medicines. You know, it's like there's how many different medicines exist, but by having an essential medicine list that says, okay, we got to make sure these, by a human rights standpoint, are available to our population because they're essential, you know. And so by focusing on those are ensured to be available at, you know, clinic level or accessible through going up to the next level. The same with diagnostics. So if there is a diagnostics list, then that's a way that a primary healthcare center, a district can say, hey, urine glucose testing is cheap and essential, and it's been assessed by WHO as cost effective and of clinical utility and accuracy and all that, you know. So it's a way to say, okay, we got to make sure those are focused on in the supply chain, in procurement, in quality. And so there are tools like that, ways to help governments to improve healthcare access, even in island countries. Thanks.
I see. Yep, thank you so much for the answer, Mr. Himley. And yep, any other questions from the audience? Or so from the committee members, maybe, of the conference? Feel free.
Moderator, hello.
I was asked to ask this question for all speakers. Is there possibility of the event organizer university, which is Universitas Islam Negeri, or in English, the State Islamic University Alauddin Makassar / Goa, I apologize, in South Sulawesi, Indonesia, to have some type of collaboration with you all, either as a representative of institution / agency, or in maybe person to institution type collaboration. Yep,
Maybe I'll go
anyone?
Yeah,
please.
I'll just go first. We have something called WHO collaborating centers. And those can be developed with any institution. It's a two-way street. WHO helps provide technical support and assistance to the center, but the collaborating center also provides some kind of expertise that helps with the mission of WHO, that helps with the country to work on its strategic priorities or the country's technical assistance requests. For example, here in India, in New Delhi, there's a collaborating center that is a National Health Resource Center that has biomedical engineers that provide equipment maintenance expertise. So they're a collaborating center for us, and they can be used outside of this of India to help with support. So if Aladdin has an expertise that that can be provided, then that's an area for collaboration. Thanks.
Wonderful, wonderful. Yes, please, Dr. Khan or Dr. Ilabuchi.
Okay, so because BMS is a global company and there are well set out regulations and ways to collaborate with the company, I cannot actually set up individual collaborations with institutions myself, because there's a whole department in legal that's responsible for that. However, what I would advise is you could go to bms.com/researchers. And once you go there, there's a link there that actually gives you like stepwise instructions of how to actually get in touch with BMS and collaborate. And there's so many numerous collaborations that we're having. Like I mentioned earlier, we're currently working in numerous immuno-oncology areas, trying to figure out how we can actually activate the patient's immune system to tackle cancer cells. So if that's an area anyone is interested in, reach out to BMS. If you have research ideas, if you want to have a site over there to conduct research, to have people actually enrolled in clinical trials, reach out to BMS on that website I just gave you now. And I'm sure someone's going to reach back out to you and tell you how to set up collaborations.
Cool. And lastly, Dr. Khan.
Yeah. So I'm not affiliated with a specific organization. A lot of the research I do is with the I do research with the Department of Medicine with WVU, and then with the Department of Gastroenterology as well. And I've worked with the School of Pharmacy. So I've collaborated with people within the West Virginia University organization. So a lot of my research is sort of self-driven. With that said, I mean, especially, I think especially with a lot of the research we do a lot of database analysis, and we work with big data. So, if there are people affiliated with the university that have experience with big data structures, artificial intelligence, that's something that not just me, but my colleagues are always looking for someone to add to the team for their expertise. So especially with electronic medical record data, there's so much data, you need someone with a good background in database analysis to help see through all that. So
Sounds good. Sounds good. Yeah, thank you for the resources and also for the answers as well from WHO, from the BMS. Lastly, we're close to 11 p.m. here, EST, in Eastern Standard Time, and 11 a.m. in Indonesia, Central Indonesia time. There is another question from the live audience from the hotel hall. Feel free to open your mic and deliver the question, please.
Hello, you can hear me? Hello.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, I want question to Chibusa and Himley. I want to know your opinion about technology in Indonesia, especially in healthcare system. We know that AI net the data, then the data from the people, but we have a barrier and challenge in Indonesia because some people still believe the traditional way, so they don't come to healthcare facility. Just want to know about your opinion about that. Thank you.
Rudy?
Yes.
I didn't get the full question.
I think the basic question is what did I have forgot to ask the person's name. I apologize. I believe the question was about like what is your opinion on the Indonesian healthcare system? I believe. Was there any other question other than that? Can the brother re-ask the questions? I'm just wondering if I missed like another point.
Ya, mungkin boleh ditanyakan bagaimana
Sure.
kalau artificial intelligence kan butuh data, sedangkan di Indonesia kita tahu bahwa masih banyak orang yang tidak memeriksakan diri ke fasilitas kesehatan, lebih percaya ke tradisional dukun dan sebagainya. So mungkin itu menjadi tantangan dan hambatan untuk bagaimana kita bisa mengimplementasikan teknologi dalam keputusan-keputusan untuk kesehatan di Indonesia. Itu saja, terima kasih.
I see. Wow, that's a very deep question, by the way. So what's your opinion on healthcare systems in Indonesia? And I'm not stopping there. A country of which people are sometimes, okay, I'm not. So some of the people, they tend to go to, traditional healers, and then we just talked about the whole fancy things like AI devices or methods in figuring out the efficacy or safety of medicines or health devices and stuff like that. And I believe please feel free to be answered by all speakers. So what do you all think? Or can you suggest Indonesia in terms of how to better implement the health technology in a country with challenges of having many people who don't really go to healthcare providers, like proper ones? And the second one, I believe, if I can add, it also talks about the question. It talks about the Indonesia not really having like maybe sophisticated data sets to work on. So the first one is the fact that some Indonesian people still go to traditional healers, not like clinical or like proper healthcare providers. And then second one, Indonesia not having resources in this case. Yeah, go ahead. It's very challenging.
I agree, and I believe this might actually be more a question that Stephen might be better equipped to answer, because it's more a question of access, disparities, and of course maybe just we might actually open a whole other new discussion about preference too. And I don't know, as I would answer as a pharmacist, one, I was trained to first only prescribe medications or dispense medications that have been approved by a competent agency, meaning the medication has undergone trials. We know exactly what the medication can do. We know exactly what adverse events to expect, and we know the extent, so dosing, frequency, duration, all of that. We know that. And that's why, for me, if you ask me what's my perspective, I would say I will always, and I come from a place, just to side note, I come from a place where we also depend on herbal medicines. Herbal medicine was big when I was growing up in Nigeria. So I did know a lot of people who also did not go into hospitals to get care. Instead, they got care from the herbalists, although they were also expected, or they were called healers back there, people still went there and got medications. So it's a question about access, if that is dependent on culture of a place. So if the belief of a people is that these medicines work, then I cannot sit here and tell them to stop using it. However, I know that as a scientist, I can only recommend scientifically proven and back-tested medications and treatments that have been approved by a competent authority in the country.
I see. Then Dr. Han or Mr. Himley, please. Any comment? Yes.
I think Mr. Himley would probably be better able to answer that question. So.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. There's really two major areas in that question. One is about the traditional medicine, which WHO does not. WHO used to say, well, we need to focus only on modern medicine. The problem is the access to any care. There are a huge proportion of the global population that has only access to traditional medicine. And there may be value in many of those. They're just not studied. And so we have 2 people in my office that work on traditional medicines, especially in the Asia region, that there are a large reliance on traditional medicines. So our stance is not that, only focus on modern medicine. There is a place for those. And if that's the place where people access that, then, it can be better than nothing and maybe of good value. So that's one area. The other area is, why do people, if they have a choice between modern medicine and traditional medicine, do they choose the traditional? And that goes a lot to the quality of care that they perceive or that they have received in their primary healthcare center. And so, if you assess that, obviously there is low quality because there's inadequate human resources, there is inadequate drugs, inadequate diagnostics devices, et cetera. And so the perception can be real. On the other hand, as those improve, that perception improves. And so a third part of the question was, can health technologies affect that? And certainly, as technologies get to the first level of care, they improve the quality of care. And there's probably tools, and maybe this is a place where a researcher from Aladdin can tackle, where, okay, data is hardly available, but smartphones are becoming ubiquitous. There is data built in there. Can there be tools developed for primary healthcare level and access that, not just clinical data, but quality data, communications information that can encourage people to go to the primary healthcare level. We're displaying the improved quality of care being delivered on the most remote islands even. Thank you.
Wow. Yeah. Any additional answers, Dr. Han? Come on.
No, I can't really speak to traditional medicine in and of itself. I will say though, that question does remind me, we do have, at least in the United States, it's not so much about traditional medicine versus like studied medicine, but it's even prescription medicine that's been studied. I mean, the problem with the United States is that it's so expensive. People have trouble paying for their medicines in the United States. And by the way, this really branches off of that question, but it's interesting because the access to medicine in the United States is troubling for a different reason, just because of cost and people. It's even like insulin, for example, which is like a basic medicine. I'm pretty sure it's on WHO's list of essential medicines, but that medicine, I mean, depending on where you are, you might have to pay, in the United States, depending on your insurance, you might have to pay a lot of money, which is kind of ridiculous, especially if you're like a type 1 diabetic. So, that's something that access to medicine it's a problem everywhere. So and it's something that we definitely need to keep working on. So
yeah. Wow, I was wowed from those answers, and if I can summarize for the last questions. So it all depends on lots of factors, and what we can do as healthcare providers and also health researchers, we have to provide something that can attract like these people. And I think Mr. Himley mentioned it depends on their experience when they come to the clinics / hospitals. It depends on their economical situation, like financial situation, whether they can afford the medications or how to pay the medical bills and stuff like that. Yep, it's a big homework, I know, but we're working on it. Yep, with that last questions, I would like to wrap up this session. I would like to thank all three wonderful speakers. Thank you so much. And of these three topics that the speakers have presented, it's all about like access to care, providing proper diagnostic test, or not even that, before that, the screening phase. In Dr. Khan's presentation, we learned that pancreatic cancer can actually screened way before that, but we need a proper method to conduct the screening itself. And then from Dr. Iloabuchi's presentation, we learned that there are many available analysis approaches that we can go with whenever we're conducting our health studies, no matter what field we are in. And then lastly, from Mr. Himley, we learned there is health inequities in Southeast Asia, and one of them in Indonesia. We've talked about prioritization of like health funding allocations, and all stakeholders pretty much have to work together in order to conquer these issues. Thank you so much, and I will hand back the microphone to the organizing committee. Again, my deep gratitude for trusting me to lead the discussion. I really appreciate that, and I believe before the three speakers leave, the organizing committee has certificates to be virtually handed on to you all, please. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Rudy. Ladies and gentlemen, the next agenda is delivering token of appreciation to the speaker and the chairman. But because they are not here, so we will deliver the token appreciation symbolically. Please, committee, to share the electronic certificate. The first, for Mr. Salman Khan. Thank you.
thank you.
Next, Mr. Sibusi.
Thank you.
And then Mr. Stephen Himley. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And also our chairman, Mr. Rudy Safaruddin. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Okay, we will have a coffee break now, and next agenda will be started after coffee break. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good day. Thank you, Salman. Thank you, Obi. Thank you, Stephen. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.